The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of passengers rushing through, the hum of overhead announcements blending with the shuffle of footsteps and the rustle of luggage. Through it all, Zara Davis stood still, her suitcase at her side, her hands clasped tightly around her boarding pass. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold glow, but Zara felt a growing warmth in her chest, anticipation mixed with a tinge of excitement. She'd been waiting for this trip for weeks, a long overdue break after years of pushing herself in her career as a civil rights lawyer. Dressed in a tailored black blazer, Zara kept her look professional, but her mind raced with all the things she had yet to do. With a sigh, she checked the time on her phone. Flight 216 to Los Angeles, boarding in 15 minutes. She was finally going to visit family, to unwind after months of fighting battles in courtrooms and boardrooms. Zara approached the gate, where a flight attendant in a crisp uniform greeted her. But as Zara handed over her boarding pass, she saw the attendant's eyes narrow. It was brief, a flicker of hesitation, but Zara caught it, her stomach twisted with an unsettling feeling. "Ma'am," the attendant said, "I'm sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket." Zara's brows furrowed. What kind of issue? The attendant hesitated again before speaking, her tone colder than before. "Your ticket's showing as invalid for boarding. I'm going to need you to step aside while I check with my supervisor." Zara's heart raced. Her ticket? Invalid? She had booked it directly with the airline weeks ago, received her confirmation without issue. "There must be some mistake," she said, keeping her voice calm but firm. The attendant didn't reply but gave a quick nod to a nearby security guard who stepped forward, his eyes assessing Zara like she was a problem. "What's the issue here?" the guard asked, his eyes now on Zara. The attendant explained the situation, her words clipped. "This passenger's ticket isn't valid for boarding." Zara's stomach churned. "But that's not true. My ticket was confirmed." The guard glanced at her and then at the attendant. "Let me check the system," he muttered, tapping at his tablet. A few moments passed before he shook his head. "Yeah, I don't see it. You'll have to leave, ma'am." The words hit Zara like a slap. "I'm sorry, but no, I'm not going anywhere," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need you to step away from the gate," the guard said again, this time more forcefully. Zara's mind raced, but the humiliation burned in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening. This had never happened to her before. Standing there, Zara felt a wave of anger wash over her. Her frustration, her sense of injustice, it all bubbled up. She had fought for years for equality, for people to be treated with fairness and dignity. But here she was, in an airport, being treated like a criminal, like someone who didn't belong in the space she had every right to be in. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, some curious, some uncomfortable, some judging. Zara's gaze met the attendant's, and for a moment, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let them take away her dignity. "I'm not leaving this gate," Zara said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She could feel the heat of her own anger rising, but she held it in check. This wasn't just about her. She took out her phone, and with hands that barely shook, she tapped the screen, quickly finding the number she needed. As the phone rang, she kept her eyes on the attendants, their smug faces beginning to falter. Just 10 minutes later, the entire atmosphere in the terminal shifted. Zara stood still as she saw the sleek black car pull up outside. Her private jet, already at the airport. The reality of it made the weight on her chest ease just slightly. They had underestimated her. The car's driver stepped out, scanning the terminal before his eyes found Zara. "Miss Davis?" he called, his tone respectful. "Your jet is ready." Zara walked toward the door with purpose. Each step felt like a quiet victory, her composure unbroken despite the way her heart pounded. She passed the gate staff, their eyes wide with shock. The guard stepped aside, his face pale, now fully aware of the mistake he'd just witnessed. Zara stepped out into the crisp air, the wind lifting her hair. She followed the chauffeur across the tarmac toward the jet stairs, her back straight, head high. She could still hear the murmurs behind her, but she didn't look back. Inside the jet, Zara sank into the plush seat, the soft hum of the engines a contrast to the tension she had left behind. She gazed out of the window at the terminal below, the city sprawling in the distance. Her hands rested in her lap, still trembling slightly from the rush of emotions. It had been a long time since she'd been made to feel small, and the injustice of it stung. But as the jet took off, she let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing. The weight of everything, the humiliation, the disbelief, began to fade. She wasn't just leaving an airport behind. She was leaving a world of assumptions and barriers that would never define her again. Zara pulled out her phone and drafted an email to the airline, recounting everything. She didn't ask for revenge, just respect. It wasn't about one person. It was about a system that needed to be better, that needed to see people for who they really were. As the jet ascended higher, leaving the tarmac and the city below, Zara's thoughts drifted, the sounds of the engines a soft, steady hum in the background. Outside, the sky darkened as the last traces of sunlight faded, and the vast expanse of clouds stretched endlessly ahead. But inside the cabin, a sense of quiet determination took root in her heart. The attendants moved gracefully around the cabin, offering drinks and small snacks, their movements smooth and practiced. Zara didn't notice much of this at first. She had always been a woman who valued silence, time to reflect, to gather her thoughts and sort through the layers of what had just transpired. The events at the airport weren't just a minor inconvenience, they were a catalyst for something deeper. The encounter had triggered something inside her, something she hadn't realized she'd been suppressing for years. She thought about the way she'd been treated earlier, the skepticism in the attendants' eyes, the dismissive tone of the guard, the way they had presumed she didn't belong. It wasn't just about the ticket or the airport gate. It was about the subtle, pervasive assumptions people like her had to deal with every day. Being black, being a woman, meant that sometimes, despite your achievements, despite your status, you were still made to feel invisible, unworthy of certain spaces. Zara clenched her fist around the edge of the armrest, the thoughts swirling inside her like a storm. But then, just as quickly, she exhaled. She couldn't afford to let this anger consume her. Not when she had worked so hard to get to this point, not when her energy had always been directed toward fighting for change, for creating spaces where everyone could stand tall, regardless of the color of their skin or the power they held. As the jet cruised above the clouds, Zara allowed herself to take a deep breath, releasing the tension that had clung to her chest. She was no longer just a passenger on this flight. She was on a journey, a larger one that had nothing to do with the jet, but everything to do with the path she was carving for herself and for others. She pulled out her phone again, this time scrolling through her contacts. Her fingers hovered over the numbers as she considered her next steps. It wasn't enough to just file a complaint or send an email. This was bigger than that. She knew the system had failed her today, but she also knew that the very same system needed to be held accountable. Change wasn't going to come from staying quiet. It wasn't going to come from just brushing things off. She was a lawyer, yes, but she was also a leader, a voice for those who couldn't speak up for themselves. Her phone buzzed in her hand. The airline had already replied to her email. The response was swift, almost too swift. The executive team expressed their regret for the incident and assured her that it would be investigated. They also mentioned the possibility of reviewing their staff training. It wasn't the grand gesture she had hoped for, but it was a start. A small victory, but one that meant something. Zara read the email twice, her lips curling into a faint smile. This wasn't a battle she had fought for personal gain. It was for the people who still struggled in silence, the ones whose voices were drowned out by prejudice and bias. She wasn't fighting just for herself, but for the countless others who had been disregarded and overlooked simply because they didn't fit into a certain mold. Her thoughts wandered back to the faces she had seen at the airport, passengers who had witnessed her being dismissed, the look of disbelief in their eyes when the private jet landed. For a brief moment, She had wondered if they thought it was a coincidence, or if they truly understood the significance of what had just happened. To some, it might have just been a dramatic scene at an airport, but Zara knew better. The world didn't just need people to succeed, it needed people who would fight to break down the walls that held others back. She wasn't just another professional on a flight. She was someone with the power to make a change, to use her platform and her voice for something that mattered. As the night settled outside the window, the stars twinkling in the distance, Zara's thoughts turned to her next steps. She wasn't done yet. There were meetings to attend, cases to win, and laws to challenge. But more than that, there was a future she was already working toward, a future where her experiences, the good and the bad, would fuel her drive to dismantle the very systems that allowed moments like the one she'd just endured. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point to the guard or the attendant. It was about showing the world that dignity, respect, and equality could never be bought or dismissed. They were inherent to every person. The flight attendant returned with a tray, offering Zara a second drink. Zara smiled, taking a sip, her mind still focused. As she gazed out at the ever-expanding horizon, a renewed sense of purpose settled within her. She wasn't just soaring toward Los Angeles or any destination. She was soaring toward a future where her voice, and the voices of so many others, would be heard loud and clear. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed for a moment. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.